And they're going to support whatever they think the guy that pays them, wants anyway. So it doesn't mean they don't mean anything. They're nonsense. But we do care about being right about the economic characteristics of the business, and that's one thing we think we've got certain filters that tell us in certain cases that we know enough to assess, and then we make some mistakes. Charlie?
I've got nothing to add to that except that people underrate the importance of a few simple big ideas. And I think that to the extent Berkshire Hathaway is a didactic enterprise, teaching the right systems of thought, I think that the chief lessons are that a few big ideas really work. I think these filters of ours have worked pretty well. And because they're so simple.
Yeah, I think most of the people in this room, if they just focused on what made a good business or didn't make a good business and thought about it a little while, they could develop a set of filters that would let them in 5 minutes figure out pretty well what made sense or didn't make sense. I mean, there may be some reason after 5 minutes we don't get together on a deal of some sort. But another thing you can usually tell, at least you can tell it in the extreme cases, you can tell whether you've got the kind of manager very quickly that you want to have. I mean, if you've got somebody that's been batting 400 all their life and fortunately age doesn't change that picture in terms of business performance, and they love what they do, it's going to work. If the seller cares a lot about the money, you're probably not going to make a very good deal. I mean, if their real interest is is what they're going to do with the money, they may fall out of love or have less interest in their business subsequently. We love working with people who are just plain nuts about their businesses, and it works very well. And you can usually spot that. Now, having said that, we'll have a few people figuring out how to fake that attitude, when they try and sell us some piece of junk here. But Charlie says we can get conned by some guy with a green eye shade, and a low rent office and all that. But we won't get taken in by the guy with the suede shoes. Without a tax and a broker. Well, you don't have to have a broker if your neighbor happens to own it. You can make a deal privately, but the easiest way usually is through a broker. But there's no way you can do it without tax unless General Motors and General Electric decide to merge at some point. So the opportunities to switch from one security to another without tax are really limited to merger. And in terms of brokerage costs, it just happens to be that that the most economical way of finding the person in the world that wants to both buy the stock you want to sell and sell you the stock you want to buy is through an intermediary, the broker, and the cost of that actually can be relatively low.
Well, when you found Ben Graham, he was unconventional, and he was very smart. And of course, that was very attractive to you. And then when you found out it worked and you could make a lot of money while sitting on your ass, of course, you were an instant convert. And so
it still appeals to me, actually. I mean,
but the world changed before he died. Ben Graham recognized that the exact way he sought undervalued companies wouldn't necessarily work for all times under all conditions. And that's certainly the way it worked for us. We gradually morphed into trying to buy the better companies when they were underpriced instead of the lousy companies when they were underpriced. And of course that worked pretty well for us. And Ben Graham, he outlived the game that he played personally most of the time. He lived to see most of it fade away. I mean, just to find some company that's selling for 1/3 of its working capital and figure out it could easily be liquidated and distribute $3 for every dollar of market price. Lots of luck if you can find those in the present markets. And if you can find them, they're so small that Berkshire wouldn't find them of any use anyway. So we've had to learn a different game, and that's a lesson for all the young people in the room. If you're going to live a long time, you have to keep learning.
Yeah.
What you formerly knew is never enough. So if you don't learn to constantly revise your earlier conclusions and get better ones, why, I always use the same metaphor. You're like a one-legged man in an ass-kicking contest.
Yeah. If anybody has suggestions for another metaphor, send them to me. Graham, incidentally, one important point, Graham was not scalable. I mean, you could not do with really big money. And when I worked for Graham Newman Corp., here he was, the dean of all analysts, and, he was an intellect above all others around that time. But the investment fund was $6 million, and the partnership that worked in tandem with the investment company also had about $6 million in it. So we had $12 million we were working with. Now you can make adjustments for inflation, but and everything. But it was just a tiny amount. It wasn't really scalable. And the truth is, Graham didn't care because he really wasn't interested in making a lot of money for himself. So it had no reason to want to find something that could go on and become larger and larger. So the utility of Chapter 8 in terms of looking at stocks as a business is of enormous value. The utility of Chapter 20 about a margin of safety is of enormous value. But that's not complicated stuff. Yeah.
I finally figured out why the teachers of corporate finance often teach a lot of stuff that's wrong. When I had some eye troubles very early in life, I consulted a very famous eye doctor. And I realized that his place of business was doing a totally obsolete cataract operation. They were still cutting with a knife after better procedures had been invented. And I said, why are you in a great medical school performing absolute obsolete operations? He said, Charlie, it's such a wonderful operation to teach. Well, that's what happens in corporate finance. They get these formulas, and it's a fine teaching experience. You give them a formula, you present the problem, they use the formula. You get a real feeling of worthwhile activity. There's only one trouble, it's all balderdash.
Yeah, whenever you hear a theory described as elegant, watch out.
If you measure the human quality of the people who are in it. Now you can say we've collected high-grade people because we sure as hell couldn't create them. But one way or another, this is a remarkable system. And why would we tinker with it?
If you want to attract high-grade people, you probably ought to try and behave pretty well yourself.
And it's a question of being able to identify businesses that you understand and feel very certain about. And if you understand those businesses, and many people do, but Charlie and I don't, you have the opportunity to evaluate them. And if you decide they're fairly priced and they have marvelous prospects, you're going to do very well. But there's a whole group of companies, a very large group of companies, that Charlie and I just don't know how to value. And that doesn't bother us. I mean, we don't know how to figure out what cocoa beans are going to do, or the Russian ruble, there's all kinds of financial instruments that we just don't feel we have the knowledge to evaluate. And really, it might be a little too much to expect that somebody would understand every business in the world. And we find some that are much harder for us to understand. And when I say understand, my idea of understanding a business is that you've got a pretty good idea where it's going to be in 10 years. And I just can't get that conviction with a lot of businesses, whereas I can get it with a relatively few. But I only need a few. As you pointed out, you only need a few, 6 or 8 or something like that. It would be better for you, it certainly would have been better for you, if we had the insights about what we regard as the somewhat more complicated businesses you described, because there was and may still be a chance to make a whole lot more money if those growth rates that you describe are maintained. But I don't think you'll find better managers than Andy Grove at Intel and Bill Gates at Microsoft, and they certainly seem to have fantastic positions in the businesses they're in. But I don't know enough about those businesses to be as sure that those positions are fantastic as I am about being sure that Gillette and Coca-Cola's businesses are fantastic. You may understand those businesses better than you understand Coke and Gillette because of your background or just the way your mind is wired. But I don't, and therefore I have to stick with what I really think I can understand. And if there's more money to be made elsewhere, I think the people that make it are entitled to it. Charlie?
Well, if you take a business like Intel, there are limitations under the laws of physics, which eventually stop your putting more transistors on a single chip. And at 30% per annum or something like that, I don't think those limitations are still a good distance away, but they're not any infinite distance away. That means that Intel has to leverage its current leadership into new activities, just as IBM leveraged the holorith machine into the computer. Predicting whether somebody's going to be able to do that in advance it's too tough for us.
Bob Noyce.
We could quit claiming it to you.
Yeah. Bob Noyce, one of the two primary founders of Intel, grew up in Grinnell, Iowa. I think he's the son of a minister in Grinnell, and went to Grinnell College and was chairman of the board of trustees of Grinnell when I went on the board of Grinnell back in the late 60s. And when he left Fairchild to form Intel with Gordon Moore, Grinnell bought 10% of the private placement that funded was the initial funding for Intel. And Bob was a terrific guy, very easy to talk to, just as Bill Gates is. I mean, these fellows explain the businesses to me, and they're great teachers, but I'm a lousy student. And they really do it. They're very good at explaining their businesses. Bob was a very down-to-earth Iowa boy who could tell you the risks and tell you the upside, and enormously likable, 100% honest every way. So we did buy 10% of the original issue. The genius that ran the investment committee managed to sell those a few years later. I won't give you his name. And